The air in the dealership was thick with the smell of new paint, fresh rubber, and something else, the intoxicating aroma of easy credit. It was 1974, and Smitty, the manager at the local John Deere dealer, was a high priest of progress, preaching the gospel of bigger, faster, and financed. He had Frank Miller cornered by a brand new 4430, its green paint gleaming under the long fluorescent lights like the carapace of some giant sleeping beetle. "Frank, just look at her," Smitty said, his voice a low, persuasive hum. He slapped a massive rear tire, the sound a dull thud in the cavernous showroom. 135 at the PTO. Sound guard cab, AC, radio. You could plow all day and come out feeling like you just sat in your living room. The 4020 was a great tractor, the best of its day. But its day is over. You can't compete with this. Frank ran a calloused hand over the cool sheet metal of the hood. He knew the machine, knew the specs by heart. The new generation of John Deere tractors were marvels of engineering, no doubt about it. But he also knew the price tag that came with them, a number with enough zeros to make a man's blood run cold. "She's a fine machine, Smitty. Not saying she isn't," Frank said, his voice calm and steady. "But I just came in for a hydraulic filter and a couple of O-rings for my 4020. Smitty's smile tightened just a fraction. "Frank, we can roll the cost of any parts right into the financing. We can have you in this cab by tomorrow. Peterson just signed the papers on a 4630. A 4630, Frank. He's going to be working circles around you." As if on cue, the office door swung open, and Richard Rich Peterson strode out, a sheaf of papers in one hand and a grin that was all teeth. He was the kind of man who wore his brand-new seed corn cap indoors, the brim still perfectly flat. He saw Frank standing by the 40430, and his grin widened. "Well, well, Miller. Smitty finally talking you into the 20th century?" Peterson drawled, hooking his thumb toward the gleaming green giant. "Or you still planning on farming that quarter section with your museum piece?" Frank felt a familiar tightening in his gut, but he kept his face impassive. He and Peterson had grown up on neighboring farms. Frank's father had taught him that the land was a partner you worked with, not a resource you conquered. Peterson's father had taught him that the man with the most toys wins. "My museum piece still pays the bills, Rich," Frank said evenly. "And it's paid for. Can you say the same about that 4630? Peterson's face darkened. "It's called leverage, Miller. An investment. Something you wouldn't understand. While you're out there wrenching on that old junk, I'll have my corn in the ground and be halfway to the lake. The bank knows a good bet when they see one. They're backing me on another 80 acres next to yours, too." Smitty jumped in, trying to smooth things over. "Now, boys, we're all neighbors here. Frank, the point is, the money is cheap right now. The government wants us planting fence-a-row to fence-a-row. You can't do that with a 100-horse tractor. We can work the numbers. Your 4020 is a clean machine. I'll give you top dollar on a trade-in." Frank shook his head slowly. He looked past the new tractors, through the big plate-glass window, to where his old Ford F-100 pickup sat in the gravel lot. It was faded, a few dings in the tailgate, but he knew every nut and bolt on it, just like he knew his 4020. He'd rebuilt the engine himself 2 winters ago. He knew the peculiar whine the hydraulics made when the oil was cold. He knew the exact spot on the clutch you had to feather to get a smooth start with a heavy load. That tractor wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of himself, a steel partner that had never let him down. It carried no interest, no liens, no bankman's sleepless nights. "I appreciate the offer, Smitty," Frank said, turning his back on the 4430. "But I'll just take that filter and the O-rings." Peterson let out a short, derisive laugh. Suit yourself. Some people are just allergic to making money. He slapped Smitty on the back. Get that 4630 delivered this afternoon, Smitty. I want to smell that new paint in my own machine shed tonight. Frank paid the parts man in cash, the crisp bills a stark contrast to the thick stack of financing papers Peterson had just signed. As he walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the screen door slamming behind him, he heard Peterson's voice drift through the open window. Can you believe that guy? His old man was the same way. Scared of his own shadow. He'll be broke in 5 years. Mark my words. Frank didn't look back. He settled into the familiar worn seat of his pickup, the smell of dust and honest work, a welcome relief from the sterile dealership. He had work to do. The old 4020 was weeping a bit of hydraulic fluid from the rock shaft housing, and planting season was breathing down his neck. Now, before we get too deep into this story of iron and earth, I have to ask you folks listening a question. What was the most reliable piece of iron you or your family ever owned? Was it a 2-cylinder Johnny Popper that refused to die? A tough-as-nails red Farmel? Or maybe an old grey Alice Chalmers? Let me know down in the comments, because a man's choice of tractor, whether he buys new or sticks with the old, says a whole lot about the kind of man he is. It tells you whether he trusts the bank or whether he only trusts his own 2 hands. Back in his workshop, the world shrank to the task at hand. The air hung heavy with the smells of solvent, grease, and hot steel. Frank's shop wasn't fancy. No polished concrete floor or bright overhead lights like the one Peterson had just built. It was the same shop his father had used, with a dirt floor packed hard as stone, and a single bare bulb hanging from a rafter, casting long shadows that danced with the flicker of the wood stove in the corner. The John Deere 4020 sat in the center of the floor, its familiar green hood showing the scuffs and scrapes of a decade of hard work. The leak was slow, but persistent, a dark stain weeping down the back of the transmission case. It was the kind of thing a man like Peterson would ignore until it became a gusher. Then he'd call the dealer's mobile mechanic out at $200 an hour. For Frank, it was a challenge, a conversation with the machine. He started by draining the 20 gallons of high-guard transmission fluid, the warm, honey-colored oil flowing into a wide drain pan. That smell was the lifeblood of the tractor. He knew it like other men knew the smell of coffee. He pulled the operator's seat and the platform, the heavy steel plates coming away with a grunt of effort, revealing the complex guts of the machine's hydraulic system. The rockshaft housing was the heavy cast-iron heart of the 3-point hitch, and it had to come off. Using a chain hoist rigged to a thick wooden beam overhead, he carefully supported the housing. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands moving with a certainty born of countless hours spent with steel and oil. He knew which wrench to grab without looking, the 1/2 inch for the hydraulic lines, the big 3/4 for the main bolts. The bolts groaned in protest, sealed by years of dirt and pressure, but they surrendered to the steady torque from Frank's strong arms. With the housing finally free, he lowered it onto his workbench, a massive thing made of railroad ties. The problem was clear. The piston packing and the O-rings on the main shaft were worn flat, brittle as old plastic. They were the simple, inexpensive parts that did the hard work, the blue-collar heroes of the hydraulic system. He carefully scraped out the old, hardened seals with a small pick, his movements precise. He cleaned every groove and channel with a solvent-soaked rag until the cast iron shone, free of grit and grime. This was the part of farming the new generation didn't understand. They saw it as downtime, as lost money. Frank saw it as an investment. He was saving himself a fortune in shop labor, yes, but it was more than that. It was knowledge. It was intimacy with the tools that put food on his table. As he worked, he inspected everything else: the valve clearances, the condition of the cam follower, the state of the draft control linkage. He found a small amount of play in one of the bushings, something the dealer's mechanic would have missed, and made a note to replace it. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the new seals were in place, slick with fresh hydraulic oil. He hoisted the heavy housing back into position, carefully aligning the bolt holes. He torqued the bolts down in the proper sequence, following the pattern in the worn, grease-stained service manual that was his Bible. He reconnected the hydraulic lines, refilled the transmission with the filtered oil, and finally climbed aboard. He turned the key. The diesel engine spun to life with a familiar, throaty roar that vibrated through the concrete foundation of the barn. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power, a sound Peterson would never hear from the whisper-quiet cab of his new Ford X30. Frank worked the three-point hitch lever. The big lift arms at the back of the tractor rose smoothly, powerfully, without a shudder or a groan. He lowered them and raised them again. He let the engine idle for 20 minutes, walking around the machine, his eyes and hands searching for any sign of a leak. There was none. The steel was dry and clean. A quiet smile touched his lips. It was a small victory in a war no one else knew he was fighting. A few days later, he was at the co-op getting a load of seed corn. The place was buzzing. Peterson's new 4630 was the main topic of conversation, of course. Earl, who ran the feed grinder, was holding court by the counter. "I tell you what, that thing is a monster," Earl said, wiping his dusty hands on his overalls. "Rich drove it in yesterday to top off the fuel. Said he plowed the 80 next to the creek in one afternoon. One afternoon. Used to take his dad a week with that old Farmall M." A couple of the other farmers nodded in agreement. "That's the way to do it," one of them said. "Get big or get out. That's what the man on the radio says." Frank walked in, and a brief, awkward silence fell over the group. It was the kind of silence he was getting used to. He was the ghost of farming past, a walking relic in a world hell-bent on the future. Earl cleared his throat. "Frank, how's that 40 or 20 of yours running?" There was a slight edge to his voice, a hint of pity. "Running just fine, Earl," Frank replied, leaning against the counter. "Just put new seals in the rock shaft. She's tight as a drum." One of the younger farmers, a kid named Billy who was trying to get started on a rented piece of ground, snickered. "Fixing it again, huh, Frank? My grandpa used to say if you ain't breaking, you ain't farming. But you seem to be doing more fixing than farming these days." The others chuckled. Frank didn't rise to the bait. He just looked at the kid. "There's two kinds of farmers, Billy. Those who know how to fix their own equipment, and those who have a big line of credit at the dealership. Which one do you figure sleeps better at night?" The laughter died. Frank paid for his seed, loaded the heavy bags into the back of his pickup, and drove away, the farmer's stares feeling like physical weight on his back. They didn't get it. They saw his old iron as a liability, a sign of poverty or stubbornness. They couldn't see the freedom in it. Every time Peterson fired up that new tractor, the sound wasn't of a powerful diesel engine, but of a ticking clock, counting down the days until the next massive payment was due to the bank. Frank's 4020 made a different sound. It was the sound of ownership, the sound of independence. And to Frank, that was the sweetest sound in the world. The late 70s were a golden age, or so they said. Grain prices shot for the moon, a wave of optimism fueled by massive sales to the Soviet Union washed over the heartland. The government, the banks, the universities, they all sang the same song. expand, modernize, leverage. Land values doubled, then tripled. A farmer could walk into the bank with a deed to 160 acres and walk out with a loan big enough to buy the 80 next to him and a whole new line of equipment to farm it with. It was a fever, and Rich Peterson had it bad. He was the poster child for the new era of agriculture. The 80 acres he'd bought next to Frank was just the beginning. The next year, he bought another quarter section when old man Hemlock retired. He didn't just buy the land, he transformed it. He tore out the old fence rows and windbreaks that Frank's grandfather had planted, creating vast, unbroken fields that his big machinery could devour. He put up a massive center-pivot irrigation system on the high ground, a great metal spider that crept in a perfect circle, sucking water from the aquifer and spraying it onto the thirsty corn. His machine shed grew, a gleaming testament to his ambition. The 4630 was traded in for a brand new John Deere 4840, an articulated four-wheel drive beast that seemed to shake the very ground it rolled on. It had duals on all four wheels, a stereo in the cab, and an air-cushioned seat. He bought a new 12-row planter to go with it, and an 8-row corn head for his combine. At the county fair, his wife drove a new Lincoln, while his kids showed prize-winning steers he'd bought from a breeder in Iowa. He was featured in the State Farming magazine, standing in a field of impossibly tall corn, his arm around the banker, both of them smiling like kings. Rich became more insufferable with every new purchase. He'd drive by Frank's place, slowing his new truck down just to watch Frank cultivating his corn with his old Farmall H, the same tractor his father had bought new in 1951. He'd lean out the window and shout, "Hey, Miller, that thing belongs in a parade, not a field." Frank just waved and kept driving. He was marching to a different beat. While the rest of the county was caught up in the frenzy of expansion, Frank was battening down the hatches. The high grain prices were a blessing, and he didn't squander it. He sold his corn and soybeans at the peak of the market, but the checks didn't go to Smitty at the John Deere dealership. The first big check went straight to the bank, paying off the last remaining mortgage on his farm, a debt his father had taken on 20 years before. The day he walked out of the bank with the deed, free and clear, was one of the proudest of his life. There was no fanfare, no article in the paper. It was a quiet, personal victory. He put the rest of the money away, some in savings bonds, some in a simple savings account at that same bank. He bought a few more head of beef cattle, expanding his herd slowly, paying cash. He replaced the roof on the barn and put a new coat of red paint on it. He was improving his farm, not just expanding it. He was building a foundation, not a house of cards. To everyone else, he looked like a failure, a man who lacked vision. At the grain elevator one fall afternoon, as they both waited in line to unload, Peterson cornered him. "I just don't get you, Miller," Rich said, shaking his head in genuine disbelief. He gestured back toward his brand-new tandem-axle grain truck, a shining chrome and red Peterbilt. Frank had hauled his corn in with his old single-axle Chevy C60. "You could have had all this. The bank was begging you to take the money. You could have doubled your operation, maybe tripled it. Instead, you paint your barn. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're too scared to dig." "I'm sleeping at night, Rich," Frank said simply, looking him straight in the eye. "Are you?" Peterson just laughed, a loud, booming sound that turned heads. "I sleep like a baby on a pile of money, my friend. You gotta spend money to make money. It's the American way." But late at night, alone in his workshop, with the radio playing softly, Frank heard things that troubled him. He wasn't an economist, but he was a man who understood cycles. He understood that what goes up must come down. The news anchors started talking about inflation, a word that sounded like a disease. They mentioned interest rates, and how the Federal Reserve was going to have to do something to stop the economy from overheating. The numbers kept climbing. 6%, 8%, 10%. One evening, while he was meticulously rebuilding the carburetor for his old H, a voice on the radio cut through the static. It was a news report about the new Federal Reserve chairman, a man named Paul Volcker. The reporter said Volcker was a hawk, that he was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. He was talking about raising the prime interest rate, the rate the banks paid, to levels not seen since the Civil War. Frank stopped what he was doing, the tiny jet from the carburetor held in the tips of his pliers. He listened intently as the reporter explained what that would mean. Farm operating loans, which had been available for years at 7 or 8%, could soon be double that, or more. A cold knot formed in the pit of Frank's stomach. He put the carburetor part down and walked to the big sliding door of his shop. He pushed it open, the cool night air washing over him. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over his fields. His corn was harvested, his beans were in the bin, his land was his machines were his crop was his. He owed nothing to any man. He looked across the gravel road, over the fence to Rich Peterson's farm. The security light on Peterson's new machine shed cast a brilliant, sterile glare over a kingdom of debt. The massive 4840, the new combine, the gleaming grain truck, the silent sleeping center pivot, they were monuments to the good times. But they were owned by the bank, every single piece, and their existence depended on cheap money and high grain prices. Frank watched the long shadow of Peterson's biggest grain bin stretch across the land, a dark finger pointing directly at his own farm. The party was almost over, and Frank knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the hangover was going to be brutal. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't in the sky, but on the television screen. In January of 1980, the president announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The news hit the coffee shops and co-ops like a physical blow. The market that had fueled the boom years, the endless demand that had justified every loan and every expansion, vanished overnight. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $3 a bushel, plummeted to $2.25 and showed no sign of stopping. At first, Rich Peterson and farmers like him brushed it off. "It's political," he'd say, holding court at the diner. "It'll blow over in a few months. You watch. We'll be selling them grain again by harvest." He talked with the same blustering confidence, but Frank saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand trembled just slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. The swagger was starting to crack. For Frank, the price drop was a concern, but not a catastrophe. It meant less profit, a tighter belt for the coming year. For Rich, it was a dagger aimed at the heart of his empire. His operating loan for that year had been calculated on $3 corn. His payment schedule to the bank was based on a steady, optimistic cash flow that no longer existed. The real trouble started that spring. It had been a wet April, and every farmer was chomping at the bit to get in the fields. A 3-day window of dry weather opened up, and the county became a frantic hive of activity. Frank was out before sunrise, his 4020 pulling his 6-row planter, the diesel engine barking its familiar, reliable rhythm. He could see the lights of Rich's 4840 across the section, the big articulated tractor pulling a massive 24-row planter, moving at a speed Frank could only dream of. Rich would be done in a day. It would take Frank the better part of 3. But on the afternoon of the second day, Frank noticed the lights on the 4840 weren't moving. They were stationary, sitting in the middle of that vast, dark field. An hour later, they were still there. Curiosity finally got the better of him. After finishing his own row, he drove his pickup down the gravel road and pulled up to the edge of Rich's field. The scene was one of quiet, expensive frustration. The giant tractor was silent. Rich was on his knees beside one of the enormous rear wheels, his face streaked with grease and dirt. A cell phone, a new and costly piece of technology in itself, pressed to his ear. He was shouting. "What do you mean you can't get the part until tomorrow? I'm losing my planting window right now. It's just a damn sensor." Frank got out of his truck and walked into the field. The soft earth gave way under his boots. "Trouble, Rich?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Rich looked up, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. "The whole damn hydraulic system shut down, Frank. The computer says it's a pressure sensor in the main valve block. A $50 part has turned this $250,000 machine into a lawn ornament." He threw a wrench into the dirt in disgust. "Smitty's mechanic is tied up, and they don't have the part in stock anyway. Have to get it from the regional warehouse in Des Moines." Frank looked at the tractor. It was a technological marvel, but it was also a fortress. The complex electronics and computer-controlled systems were a black box. There were no simple linkages to adjust, no seals you could replace with a standard pick and a hammer. It required a laptop and a trained technician. "No way to bypass it?" Frank asked. "Bypass it?" Rich laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "The computer won't let the engine run at full power or engage the PTO if it gets a bad reading. It's a safety feature, they said. It's supposed to protect the transmission." He kicked one of the huge tires. "It's protecting it so well I can't even use it." For the next day and a half, the 4840 sat idle while the sun shone and the wind blew, drying the soil. Frank finished his planting. He cultivated his first fields. He watched as the dealer's service truck finally arrived, and a young mechanic in a clean uniform spent 2 hours replacing a component the size of a thumb. The bill, Frank later heard, was over $900 for the service call, labor, and the part. Rich had lost a day and a half of perfect planting weather, a loss that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in bushels that would never grow. That was the first crack. Others followed. The price of diesel fuel doubled. The interest rate on Rich's operating loan, which was a variable rate tied to the prime, jumped from 9% to 15%, then to 18%. The monthly payment on his land ballooned. The banker, who had once taken him out for steak dinners, now left curt messages on his answering machine. Rich grew thin and withdrawn. The confident bravado was replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He sold off his herd of cattle to make a land payment, flooding the local market and driving down prices for everyone, including Frank. But it was a finger in a dike that was already crumbling. The kingdom built on cheap credit and endless optimism was being washed away by a flood of economic reality, and there was nothing Rich Peterson could do to stop it. The fall of 1982 was cold and bleak, and not just because of the weather. The farm crisis had tightened its grip on the heartland, choking the life out of families who had worked the same land for generations. Foreclosure notices were tacked to the doors of county courthouses like funeral wreaths. The classified section of the local paper was filled with auction announcements, each one a tombstone for a failed farm. In October, the biggest one yet appeared: complete dispersal of Peterson farms. The day of the auction was grey and raw, with a bitter wind that whipped across the harvested fields and chilled a man to the bone. Half the county was there, not in celebration, but as mourners at a wake. They stood in clusters on Rich's meticulously gravelled driveway, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. The gleaming machines that had once been symbols of progress and prosperity were now lined up in neat, silent rows, each with a number taped to its windshield. They looked like captured soldiers awaiting their fate, Frank stood near the back, leaning against the fender of his old Ford. He saw Smitty, the John Deere dealer, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. He saw the banker, a man named Harris, standing by the auctioneer's truck, his face impassive, a clipboard in his hand. And he saw Rich. Rich was a ghost of the man he had been. He stood beside his wife near the porch of the farmhouse, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow and vacant. He stared out at the crowd, at the machines, at the land he was losing, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. He didn't seem to see anyone. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a voice like a gravel road, started with the small items. Tools, wagons, fuel tanks. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. Men who were once proud and independent now looked at a set of wrenches and had to calculate if they could afford the $20. Then came the big iron. The Peterbilt grain truck, a giant of chrome and steel, sold for less than half of what Rich owed on it. The big 12-row planter went for a third of its value to a corporate farm from 2 counties over. The crowd murmured. It was a slaughter. Finally, the auctioneer gestured to the main event. "All right, folks, here she is, the one you've been waiting for. A John Deere 4840, 4-wheel drive, power shift, 3 remotes. This machine is clean, folks, barely broke in. What'll you give me?" Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the machine shed. The tractor that had been Rich's pride and joy, the symbol of his entire philosophy, sat there under the grey sky. And nobody made a bid. It was too big, too complex, too thirsty for fuel that no one could afford. It was an artifact from a different, more hopeful time. The auctioneer tried again, his voice straining. "Come on, people, this is a top-of-the-line machine. Let's start the bidding at $50,000. Do I hear 50? More silence. $50,000 was a king's ransom. It was more than most of the men in the crowd would clear in 5 years. The banker, Harris, stepped forward and had a quiet word with the auctioneer. The auctioneer nodded grimly. "All right, folks, the bank has a reserve on this piece. We'll move on." It was the ultimate humiliation. The machine was so worthless in the current economy that the bank would rather repossess it than sell it for what the market would bear. Frank watched as Rich flinched, as if he'd been struck. That tractor wasn't just a machine, it was the embodiment of his dream, and the crowd's silence was a final, damning verdict on that dream. While the auction for the big combine was underway, Frank quietly made his way over to a smaller, forgotten piece of equipment parked behind the shed. It was an old John Deere Model B, the classic Johnny Popper, with a sickle bar mower attached. It was the first tractor Rich's father had ever owned, kept for sentimental reasons. It was covered in dust, one tire was flat, but Frank could see the simple, honest iron underneath. It represented a different path, a different way of thinking. When the auctioneer finally got to it, most people had lost interest. "Okay, we got an old Model B here, as is. Where is? What am I bid?" $500, Frank said, his voice clear and steady. The auctioneer looked surprised. He glanced around. "I got 500. Anybody give 6? No one moved. Sold for $500 to Frank Miller. Frank walked over to the clerk's table and paid in cash, counting out the worn bills. As he received his receipt, he saw Rich approaching him, his movements slow and deliberate. His face was ashen. "Frank," he said, his voice raspy, "what are you going to do with that old thing?" "I'm going to fix it up," Frank said simply. "Get it running. It's a good machine." Rich looked from the little tractor to the massive unsold 4840. He seemed to see the two machines for the first time, not as old and new, but as two different choices, two different answers to the same question. A flicker of understanding, of painful, devastating clarity crossed his face. "My dad loved that tractor," Rich said, his voice barely a whisper. "He paid for it in 2 years. Never borrowed a dime against it." He looked at Frank, his eyes finally focusing, and for the first time, there was no arrogance, no pity, only a deep and profound sorrow. "You were right, Frank. All this time you were right." He turned and walked back toward the empty farmhouse without another word, leaving Frank standing alone with his small, paid-for piece of iron. In the weeks that followed, the Peterson farm was picked clean. The bank took the big machinery. The new owners of the land, a faceless investment company from Chicago, plowed under the yard where Rich's kids had played. The Peterson family disappeared, moving to a small town 100 miles away, where Rich had found a job managing a parts store. The empire was gone, erased from the landscape, as if it had never been. Frank didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching a neighbor's ruin. But his own farm, the one everyone had dismissed as a relic, became an island of stability in a sea of chaos. While others were letting their fields go fallow because they couldn't get an operating loan, Frank used his savings to buy seed and fuel. He planted his corn, cultivated it with his old Farm All H, and harvested it with the 40-20. The work was harder, the hours longer, but every bushel he put in the bin was his. His workshop became a sanctuary for the community. Farmers who had once laughed at his old equipment now came to him, hat in hand. "Frank, my planter's broke, and the dealer wants $1,000 to fix it. Can you take a look?" "Frank, I can't figure out the timing on this old Massey. My dad used to know how—" He never turned anyone away. He'd spent his evenings under a bare bulb, his hands covered in grease, helping a neighbor rebuild a water pump or weld a broken axle. He didn't ask for much in return. A side of beef, help fixing a fence, a few hours of labor during harvest. He was rebuilding not just machinery, but the fabric of the community, one bolt at a time. The farmers who remained were the ones like him, the cautious, the debt-averse, the ones who knew how to make do and fix their own. They were survivors, bound together by a shared, hard-won wisdom. One day, Frank saw a "for sale" sign go up on the original 80 acres next to his place, the first piece of land Rich had bought in his quest for expansion. The investment company was selling it off. Frank drove to the county seat and went to the bank. He didn't ask for a loan. He walked up to the teller and made a withdrawal from the savings account he had so patiently fed during the good years. He bought the land for a quarter of what Rich had paid for it, and he paid in cash. He didn't tear out the fence row that divided his property from that new 80. He repaired it. That fence, to him, was a reminder. It was a line between what was his and what was not, a boundary between need and greed. Years passed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The rains returned, prices stabilized, and a fragile sense of normalcy crept back into the heartland. Frank's farm prospered in its own quiet way. He never got big, but he was secure. His son, David, grew up and decided to stay on the farm, a rare choice in a generation that had seen so many of their friends lose everything. David was a good boy, with his father's hands and his mother's steady temperament. But he had the fire of youth in him. One afternoon, he came into the workshop holding a glossy brochure from the John Deere dealership. On the cover was a new 8000 series tractor, a green behemoth of sculpted steel and glass. "Dad," he said, his voice full of excitement, "look at this. GPS steering, climate control, 300 horsepower. We could farm our ground in half the time." Frank wiped his hands on a rag and took the brochure. He looked at the pictures, at the promises of efficiency and comfort. He saw the ghost of Smitty, the ghost of Rich Peterson, smiling out from the glossy pages. He didn't say no. He just walked his son out of the shop and over to the barn. He slid open the big wooden door. Inside, clean and restored, sat the little John Deere Model B he had bought at the auction. Its green paint, which Frank had applied himself, shone in the dim light. Its tires were new, its engine meticulously rebuilt. "Your great-grandfather bought a tractor just like this one new," Frank said, his voice soft. "He and your grandma worked and saved and paid for it with cash. It fed their family through the Depression. It never made them rich, but it never let them down. It never owned them." He then led David to the 4020, which was parked in its usual spot, cool and waiting. A few more scratches marked its fenders. The seat was a little more worn, but the engine was as strong as ever. "This tractor," Frank said, laying a hand on the warm hood, "paid for this farm. It paid for your college education. It asked for nothing but fuel and oil and a little bit of my time. Every single sound it makes, from the starter turning over to the hydraulics whining on a cold morning, is the sound of freedom. It's the sound of us owing nothing to anyone." He looked his son in the eye. "That new tractor in the picture is a fine machine, but you don't pay for it with money. You pay for it with risk. You pay for it with sleepless nights. You pay for it with a piece of your independence. Before you ever think about signing a loan for something like that, I want you to learn the sound of this one first. I want you to understand what it means." A few years later, Frank was at the local hardware store when he saw a familiar face. It was Rich Peterson. He was older, grayer, and much heavier, but his eyes were clear. He was in town visiting his wife's relatives. They stood in the aisle, surrounded by the smell of fertilizer and grass seed, and for a moment an awkward silence hung between them. "Frank," Rich said finally, extending a soft hand. "Good to see you." "You too, Rich," Frank said, shaking it. "I hear you're doing well," Rich said. "Bought my old 80, I heard." "It's good land," Frank said simply. "We're taking care of it." "I know you are," Rich said, and he smiled, a genuine, sad smile. "You know, for years I was angry. At the bank, the government, the weather. But the truth is, the only person I had to be angry with was myself. You tried to tell me, in your own way. I just wasn't ready to listen." He sighed. "Managing that parts store, it taught me something. The guys who came in with cash for a 75-cent bolt were always happier than the guys putting a $2,000 turbo on credit. You knew that all along." They talked for a few more minutes, about their families, about the weather. There was no bitterness left, only the quiet understanding of two men who had survived the same storm, though in very different boats. That evening, as the sun set, casting long golden rays across the fields, Frank sat on his porch. He could hear the familiar, throaty roar of the 4020's diesel engine from the far field. David was finishing the last of the planting. The sound echoed across the valley, a steady, powerful rhythm. It wasn't the sound of progress, not the kind they sold in brochures. It was something more. It was the sound of a promise kept, a lesson learned, a legacy secured. It was the sound of a man owning his own life, free and clear on the land he loved. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world.